let me get going here. So this used to have a different title, and then I shortened it up for marketing purposes. But it is the very same talk that we've been looking at over the course of the last month: incident operational complexity. So it's focused on operations and operational complexity and insights around how to manage and plan and understand that in response to the complexity of incidents. Now, you'll notice down here at the bottom, it says from the perspective of Edgar Morin. That's the very Americanized way of saying his name. In French, it's much different. And I've practiced with it a little bit, and it's a little beyond me in terms of using a French accent. But he is a giant in complexity. He's just not very well known of in sort of the West, the sort of the United States and beyond, because he wrote very early in French. Of course, being French himself, a French philosopher and sociologist. And his earliest works, were 1970s, 1970, 1970, 1974, 1979. That book in 1979, which I will quote throughout this presentation, did not receive English translation until 1992. But had it received English translation earlier, it would have been an absolute breakthrough for understanding complexity, especially in his very philosophical way. So he forms the backbone of this presentation, which has been in development for a long time. But I didn't really have the references or the literature or the language to give this talk, develop this talk, until I reread a lot of Morin's work. Now, this also comes from a place of being a federal wildland firefighter in the United States. I've fought fire in 12 states from coast to coast, including Alaska. So I have a pretty natural affinity towards operations, and I want to understand them. I want to understand how they can work with so much inner complexity surrounded by so much external complexity. So that's where I'm going with this presentation today. So it's that's where it comes from, is both the work of Edgar Morin and my own work understanding operations. So these might be some familiar names to you. I want to sort of put us in sort of give us a good starting point. On one extreme, you have characters, very important characters like John Holland, a big deal in the Santa Fe Institute, which is maybe about 10 hours from where I live in Colorado. He wrote two very beautiful papers early on, I think in 1992, and then one before that were very philosophical, very, very qualitative. And then he spent the rest of his life, I think, being very, very quantitative from the books that I've seen. So at one point was philosophical and then became, or qualitative, and then became very, very quantitative. In fact, most of his books start off with a very, very beautiful qualitative intro to complexity before they become very concerned with computational approaches. Paul Cilliers, who I'll talk about from time to time in this presentation, is sort of in the middle of where we're at today. He has famously authored Complexity and Postmodernism, which was published in 1998. I think it's one of the more important books in the field right now. He then served as an editor for multiple books that followed the complexity and philosophical narrative, which are hard to get your hands on these days, but definitely worthwhile to read. And then there's Edgar Morin, who's sort of on the extreme philosophical end. And his 1979 work, he quotes Pascal a lot, sort of the same quote over and over again, but he doesn't, at that point in history, excuse me, have a lot of people to cite, to draw a reference from, because the work wasn't there yet. So he was and remains very philosophical about complexity. And it's very important work. In 2023, a book came out called The Challenge of Complexity, essays by Edgar Morin, which offers unparalleled insight into his work, except some of the earlier stuff from maybe 79, but there is stuff from 74 in there as well. Just some so that's where we're at. We're not asking ourselves about computational or quantitative complexity. We're asking ourselves about how a knowledge of complexity can dispose us in different ways towards the world, if that makes sense. So that's the approach, is to have a disposition towards the world and each other and emergency response that is informed by complexity. So I wanted to do a little bit of framing, but I'll be honest first. This quote where it says the incident, it used to say crisis, but when this was sort of written, Morin was using crisis in a very subdued and general way. So I just substituted crisis for incident, and you get this lovely working definition of incident that I haven't found a similar one, that using the term incident merely allows someone to say that something is wrong. So no, I can go up to you today and say that my consultancy, Operational Coherence, we're experiencing an incident, and you will automatically know that something is wrong at where I work. In the same way that Texas in the United States is having an incident, and we can know that something is wrong. So it's very common language. It forms a consensual domain where we know what incident means. It means that something is wrong. And that's a very simple and general definition, but at the same time, it is quite powerful. So then you get into, there is more of a relationality to crisis. In the last part, the term incident is now used to name that which cannot be named. I think incident is a very general word that we sort of, in the natural hazards world, which I think we're both in, we can throw that over anything and say, oh, it's an incident, and that brings with it, that engenders certain resources, certain attitudes, certain perceptions and understandings and dispositions to that work. But it's really interesting because we can look at the Christchurch earthquake from a long time ago now, and we can look at what's happening in Texas and the forest fires in earlier this year in Los Angeles, which destroyed thousands of homes. And we can look at that and not be able to come up with a name for it and still use incident. I think that's wonderful. So operations, and this is actually going to work out well because you and I are both from the same part of operations, is you get just this sort of, it's not glib, maybe it's just a little short, to live, to survive, to live. I think when you're talking about public safety, you're talking about wildland fire, I think the public has been led to believe that we're running for our lives on a regular basis, which just isn't true. If we were running for our lives on a regular basis, something would be wrong with that picture. So we have this idea that we live, so we comport ourselves in such a way that we can survive whatever it is that is a problem for us. So survival becomes an outcome. And it is an outcome that is not just limited to responders, though that is the focus here of this lecture, but it is for the general public. It is for people in an emergency operations center. Survival may not be life or death, but it may be surviving and withstanding the trials and tribulations of the incident. So survival can mean whatever it needs to mean in your context. The point is, operations are centered around, we need to comport ourselves so much so that we can survive as whatever that outcome is and continue surviving as so that we may live. And this is our first reference from this monstrous 350-page book published in 79, first in Paris in French. So as it applies to this presentation, we have thinking has already been established. This is complex thought. We're not looking for order. We're not looking for chaos. We're looking for complexity. And Morin says that we call something complex that is confused, incomprehensible, so uncertain we cannot define it. And I want to draw attention to that for just a second and say that Morin also says that complexity appears alongside a system, something to that effect. He says complexity is apparent once a system appears. So you need a system to appear in the world, and then complexity appears from that system, if that makes sense. So he's saying that complexity is taking place in the world. It is an event that happens in the world, and then we have emotional and full body reactions to it to include confusion, incomprehensibility, and uncertainty. So complexity is very much in the world, but we have embodied reactions to it. So when we say that's complex, we're not saying that we feel a certain way. We're saying there's something in the world that's having us feel a certain way. And that's an important distinction that we don't talk about often enough, is where complexity is located, and it's not in the head. It's in the world. So to get back on track, Morin is saying that complexity at one point became kind of pop culture, which I think it might have within the past 10 years here in the US. I think everything was complex. We were talking about complexity a lot. And he's saying that when people are saying in general, when they're saying, hey, this is complex, what they're really saying is I can't, when you ask them, so what's that mean? What should we do? They can't give you an answer. And Morin refers to that as observing the difficulty of responding, whereas what we're going to hopefully end up at today, or should end up today, is at a place where we engage with the challenge of complexity, which here is painted as confusion and uncertainty and incompressibility. So that's some framing that we're going to carry with us. And I thought it would be a good spot, even though you're familiar. I thought about deleting some of these slides, but I decided to leave it be because you're familiar with this topic already from our brief communications. But you'll notice there's like a fabric theme that's been apparent here, which is because it's the root of complexity is complexus, that which is woven together. So you have complexity poses the paradox of the one and the many. So complexity is one as a system, as a totality, and complexity is many as many fibers that are woven together to make the fabric shown on the left. Now, Humberto Maturana, the Chilean biologist, will tell you, his writing will tell you that there's two levels of analysis when you're looking at a system. You can choose to look at it as a whole, as a totality, or you can choose to look at it as a composite entity. So a composite entity, excuse me, a composite entity means you look at the parts. A totality means you look at the whole, and we can shift back between these as need be to as what our analysis demands. Like if you're looking at the entire emergency management system in a particular state, you might first look at it as a totality to understand how it's behaving with other totalities before you look at it as a composite entity and look at its parts. So again, briefly, complexity. So complexity in the world presents itself with the disturbing traits of a mess. So I think we might even say like wicked problems of the inextricable of disorder, ambiguity, and uncertainty. He loves saying disorder, ambiguity, and uncertainty in his work and says it so many times that it really drives the point home that that's how complexity feels. So this one involves a bit of a tangent. Are there any questions up to this point?
No, I just want to say that this is freaking amazing. I love it. It's already taken my mind down past that. It's like, I've not read Paul Celier's. I want to go and explore how to pronounce Morin properly.
It's like more. It's. I think it's. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And look, yeah, it's just fantastic. I really like where we're going with this. I'm learning a lot already.
All right. Well, this is gonna open it up a little bit, and we're gonna talk about Paul Cilliers some more and how we understand complexity. So
Mm.
this first paragraph, the first like sentence up to the semicolon, is incredibly important. And I'm going to read it, and I don't normally do that, but I guess on occasion. Complexity is not only quantities of units and interactions that defy our possibility of calculation. So one of my mentors has talked about this in the past, and if complexity is defying your possibilities of calculation, why doesn't one get a larger computer? Like, do we just continually get larger and larger computers that to solve for problems that defy our level of calculation? Do we just get such a super cray computer and bring it in, and that will solve the problem of complexity because we can solve for its quantities of units and interactions that defy our own abilities, not less our computational abilities. So he's tying complexity to quantity, which I think is a very dangerous premise, or can be a dangerous premise, because you're saying, well, if we just had a bigger computer, we wouldn't have complexity. And another way that this sort of can be a dangerous situation is, or a dangerous sort of premise, is that it becomes a matter of, okay, so we have an incident, we have responders, we have operators, we have people who are going to go out and do this. We are coordinating this emergency. How many things do we have? Okay, we have 10 things. Okay, so if we have more than 25 things, we go from order to complex. Do you see how simple that is? Like how simple and how sort of a little bit crazy that is like once it defies our abilities to calculate it, then we will have complexity and we won't have order anymore. We will have officially calculated through the complexity. And Paul Cilliers says the same thing, that complexity in different words than he would say. He says that complexity, a large number of elements is sufficient for complexity, or something to that effect. But what he does then is and that's his first characteristics of complex systems. On the next page, on the next sort of characteristic down, he says a large number of elements are necessary but not sufficient, because what you also need is a complex level of interactions, um, complex interactions among the elements. So it's not just that you have a lot of things. Having more things in the world doesn't mean it's more complex. It's the way even a small number of things are interacting that introduces complexity. And we have this idea then of there being so many things that you have uncertainty again and randomness that makes complexity always about chance. And I think to a certain degree, complexity does involve chance with what we do. But I think in the stronger sort of ontological statement is that complexity is linked to a mixture of disorder and order. And we get this from a number of different places. But he's saying it here. You get this in Waldrop, you get this in Prigogine, you get this idea of there being some form, something is stable or stable for a little while, and it's surrounded by a sea of disorder. So there is some sort of balance, and we'll talk about that in the social context here in a little bit. So we said earlier that um, complexity is our mode of thinking for this presentation, for this lecture. So he's saying something that I think a lot of people have said: simple thought solves simple problems, and those are not thought problems. Those are just simple problems. And then I can think of a couple books maybe that might have walked this line in the systems thinking narrative, but like complexity, just because we have a knowledge of complexity, that doesn't solve all of our problems, is what he's saying. In fact, he's saying that complexity doesn't in itself resolve problems. It constitutes an aid to formulating a strategy that can resolve them. And I'm not even sure resolve is the right word. I think perceive, understand, handle, manage, interact with would be the better word. And I think this is great too. Like when he's talking about complex thought, which is a big thing for him that pops up here and there. He's saying complex thought gives people a reminder that says, "Don't forget, reality is changing. Don't forget that something new can and will spring up." So when you're developing your strategies with complexity as an aid, we need to keep in mind through the emergency lens that something new is likely and can and will spring up and derail, if not sort of fully stop, the work that we're already doing. Oh. All right. So I don't know to the degree, and maybe you can speak to this. The incident command system is something that I have brought with me everywhere. I've gone or an understanding of it. I don't believe that's what you're using in New Zealand. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Very similar. The New
Okay.
Zealand framework coordinated incident management system is loosely based on the ICS. So there is relative crossover.
Okay. So when we begin to respond to the incident, we deploy ICS or something similar to it, like you were just talking about. So when the incident begins, there is, I think he uses the word accident here, but really what we should be focusing on is his usage of the word external disruption, which triggers the crisis or the incident in our case. And the possible triggers can be very diverse. We don't know what we could be working on. We're entering polycrisis, where one disaster or crisis or incident is woven into another. But you experience this thing called overloading, where the system becomes unable to resolve the problems that has resolved below certain thresholds. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So if we take an emergency management office, or a response somewhere in public safety, they were able to solve problems that they are no longer able to solve because of all the complexity and disorder and uncertainty and ambiguity that the incident has brought forth. It has overloaded the response system to include emergency management to such a degree that they can no longer solve problems that they used to be able to. That's kind of an interesting way of putting it. I haven't seen it that way before. And when I was putting this talk together, I was just, that makes so much sense, because we used to be able to function at a certain level of performance, which we cannot function at now due to the presence of the incident. And then this just last bit here, that we are not able to resolve the incident within the constraints of our organization, our complex system or complex adaptive system, within the constraints of its normal existence. That makes sense. So the system is constrained in such a way that it was through day to day and possibly through previous incidents. The constraint system came into being to eliminate disorder or reduce disorder and guide people's behavior and interactions with each other and with the environment. So within that set of constraints, the problem cannot be solved. So the incident appears as the absence of a solution. And he says then, and I wish he had gone further on this. This is from a more recent essay, relatively speaking. The absence of a solution can trigger a solution. So I think what we're looking at here is if you were able to, if you're looking at from the outside in and you're seeing that the system cannot solve the problem that it is faced with due to the constraints that exist, you will be able to fashion new ways of that system existing first and then solve the problem. So you recreate its manner of existence, and then you solve the problem from the perspective of that existence. So I think that's a very interesting thing to have said. But it really brings to light that we need to adjust the system that we're working in, And then you get this from Donaldson in contingency theory, but you get these ideas of you need to change the organization to fit the context that you're working in, which may be an incident response context. And I've had conversations before regarding this, very meaningful, about people who think you should stay in sort of a complex adaptive systems design and management all the time, so you don't have to switch things around once an incident comes. And I fully support that idea. So this is a great slide, and part of why it's a great slide is because it has this image to the left here, by Magdalena Fernandez, who was drawing something, but what they ended up drawing was a beautiful diagram of a complex adaptive social response system to a disaster, to an incident, to a crisis. And you can see, let's see if I can do this here. You can see up here, it's giving me kind of these are the boundaries. So you might have one particular part of the response system, maybe the EOC, maybe you have wildfire over here, maybe you have structural fire over here. They all have their own unique boundaries, as this is as far as you can travel from sort of the hub of the complex adaptive system. This is as far as you can travel before you're allowed to travel no longer. So the boundary actually acts as a constraint to the amount of travel or the amount of distance that you can cover before you run into the functionality or the goals of another system also working towards incident response. So it shows you how far you can go. And I like all this. It's really quite breathtaking when you look at it. You have through here, for an example, and this is kind of a shaky pen, but you have through here just this richness of interaction, and you can actually see how many different pathways these humans have taken throughout this system and how richly they're all connected to one another and how important that is for the functionality of the emergency response. If you are less complex than the thing that is a problem for you, I think the literature is in agreement that you're probably going to get bowled over. If you are more complex than what it is that is a problem for you, you will have some level of tactical advantage. However, that advantage needs to encompass the fact that, as Morin said earlier, something unexpected can and will spring up. So that's part of being a complex social response system, is having the ability to freeform and change as need be to change into more or less complex patterns of interaction. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the next slide. So again, it's hard not to like Morin, right? Because he's saying that in human society, with the constitution of culture, that's an important word, individuals develop their aptitudes for language, craftsmanship, art. Their richest individual qualities emerge within the social system. So he's being quite clear, and he's granting primacy to the social system and saying this is where people develop their richest qualities. And I think that's from experience fighting fire and moving around the country and doing whatever it is that was asked of us. I think that whatever is asked of us, I agree that you develop your most richest individual qualities within social systems. I think academically we can do very well alone, with our books and our journal articles and whatever else it is that we might be reading from. But beyond that, at a certain level, you need a social system to bring out and help you develop your richest individual qualities. So this is sort of going back to what we're talking about with disorder and order. Every social system carries disorder within itself. I think that's a very important point to make, because there may be in a sort of this proclivity towards reducing disorder as quickly as possible in any organization. even if it is being managed as a social system. Morin says that in a social system, there are disorders, but that disorder is liberty, creativity, autonomy, and innovation. So you need some level of disorder if you want those things. So it tracks that you would want maybe more disorder than normal if you're faced with something that you truly don't understand, that is confusion and that is sort of uncertainty and ambiguity and paradox, you would want more disorder and not less, which is the American way, I think, to do things, is to go to very hierarchical, bureaucratic, centralized forms of organizing where there's no disorder and you have total accountability as the leader. Whereas if we're managing and we're using complex adaptive systems as our foundation for management and perception, we understand that we need more disorder in order to have that competitive edge and overcome whatever it is that is a problem for us. And then he uses this just really funny turn of phrase where he says, some of this disorder needs to be emptied out. And I kind of picture him like emptying an aquarium into a sink or something like that. Like you're dumping the excess disorder out. I agree that it needs to be metabolized in some way. I think that the way to do that is constraints that allow you to do things and constraints that prohibit you from doing things are arranged in such a way that you never accumulate too much disorder. If everyone's going off, as we might call it, self-dispatching or going rogue or whatever term you want to throw at it, that's way too much disorder for most complex social response systems, and they can't metabolize that. But if you put in guardrails that prohibit that and disincentivize that behavior beforehand, you won't have to empty that disorder out because it'll never be generated. All right. So this is a great slide. This is about managing in complex systems. Both the top two quotes are talking about the same thing you may have heard of before, equifinality. It's also known as equiprobability in Morin's writing and elsewhere. And this is just like this is the way of managing in complex systems that I haven't enjoyed once for about 6 months on the Fireground, and I've also enjoyed it elsewhere. So equiprobability is embracing this natural aptitude of living beings that enables them to find roundabout ways to get their work done, despite there being obstacles or deficiencies or accidents. So there's the natural aptitude to find a way to get work done, and equifinality is really defined quite well here in the bottom. The equifinality phenomenon, where a system may take a number of different routes to arrive at the same result. Now, I actually sat with and interviewed somebody who I know who manages this way. And he says it starts with an ambiguous goal. And you tell people, this is what, I want this to look like, you could say, or we want to accomplish X, Y, and Z. And then the trick seems to be that you leave and you let people come up with their own pathways, their own routes to achieving the goal that you have established. Is this sounding a lot like complexity? Because you're establishing a goal, but you're acting as if you know nothing of the complexity and the challenges and the deficiencies and patterns and obstacles that the people you're assigning goals to are going through already. So you don't assume anything. You just tell them, this is what I would like to have done, and then they find their own way of getting there. I'm told through this person that they have been able to establish this particular type of management, equifinality, You're not going to believe this, and I didn't believe it either, but consistently within 6 months at different places. So, and one of the things that they did bring up is that before that culture is really established and it's understood that we're going to use ambiguous goals and you're responsible for finding the way to get there, you can have a lot of turnover or short-term turnover in the interest of long-term stability. So it's because it's so different, because it puts people in the driver's seat who are used to being told what to do, and we'll get to that. Um, I think it's very interesting because you're totally empowering people to do what they need to do as they see appropriate in their context, and then leaving them be to go do it. Because we can't, if we have a big incident, if we have a big fire, if we have a big structure fire, if we have a big wildland fire, if we have flooding, it's very unlikely that any one person has complete knowledge of what is going on. So it's not prudent to try to prescribe courses of action to those people working in those corners of that incident who do have knowledge of their local niche, but not total local knowledge, global knowledge of the incident. So it's, in many ways, it's very respectful, but it does come with growing pains. I asked this person straight out. I said, does your management style enable your organization to navigate complexity? And without even thinking, it was just an automatic absolutely. And I'll tell you why. They say that from the process of finding and creating all these pathways to achieve goals, you develop a number of different frameworks that create adaptability. So you have all these frameworks for thinking that you are an author of. They haven't been handed down to you. You have created them. I think that's a very important distinction. You've created the framework. Someone didn't create them for you. You are totally totally it is acceptable for you to develop your own frameworks, not for the sake of change, but in response to variables, he says. So you have all these different, we call them in Wildfire, we call them slides. He's using the word frameworks, that you could just develop these frameworks as need be, ad hoc, to be able to respond to the growing complexity of the situation. And this is a product of being able to sort of find your own way to goals over time. And this is a decentralized approach as well. We talk about decentralization until we're blue in the face. For the decade plus that I've been involved in this, it's decentralization. And then I used a firmer word with this person. I said, well, what do you think about distributed control? And that was a different word to use. It had different meaning than decentralization. And they were saying, oh, I guess that means that, people don't necessarily like to give up that control to distribute it. And we already know that that is the particular case. So I could go on with that particular encounter with that person, but seeing it work in real time and experiencing it, I remember waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning in the woods, being on the fire line by 7:30, and they just say, all right, go ahead, go get it. And that's equifinality. Like, that's the goal, go get it. And then you may at some point follow subsequent instructions, or they may come get you or something. But the six of us on chainsaw teams just had this natural aptitude to find a way to accomplish that goal, to get to that goal without being told every step of the way. I think that's very empowering, and that develops people and their richest qualities within complex social systems. So there's kind of a loop there. There's this last bit on this slide that I really do love. It's this notion of hypercomplexity. And I think the way that it appears in the literature, whether in 1999 or post that, is it refers to the brain pretty strongly. It refers to, not it refers to the brain in some way, this idea of hypercomplexity, but I want to take it and use it as a corresponding way of managing to equifinality. If that makes sense. I want to pair it. I want these two things to exist together. In hypercomplexity, there's a progressive development of organizational and creative abilities. Stop. There is a progressive development of more disorder than there was previously, because you need disorder to have organizational and creative abilities that are then coupled with, and this is the opposite of what we do, right? It's the opposite of what we do. It's coupled with a gradual reduction of constraints, hierarchies, and centralization. So it's just the opposite, right? Like we or at least in the United States, I think we have a tendency to go the other way and to add in more constraints, more hierarchy, and more centralization, which eliminates disorder and overcompensates with too much order. And I think that's where we find some trouble. So again, management, we find a way to manage these complex response systems through equifinality and hypercomplexity. I'm really excited about those.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Just one of the things going through my head right now is when I'm applying this to a command system or hierarchical system, is that element of assurance. When we have this distributed or decentralized approach, which I think is amazing, the biggest rub there is how do we provide assurance, and what is the retribution afterwards during that review process? How do you, from what is traditionally a very hierarchical approach where who is taking accountability, who's the fall guy, and that goes all the way to the top, all right? Because we have this hierarchical system and the order came from there. Versus what we're talking about here, how do you manage that? And maybe we come to that down the track.
I've been asked this question before in New Zealand, talking about the very, very similar thing. So I think the first place my mind goes is, and I know I just read the words that there is a gradual reduction of constraints, but I think if you have you don't design a system, I guess. I think you design I think Dave Snowden has said this in the past, you design the constraints out of which a complex system may emerge, which is an interesting way of thinking about that. So I think what I would point to is I would develop a constraint system through which I can be confident that I will get less of the wrong answers and more of the right answers. But in distributed control, within the niche of that system, and these systems can get very large and have subsystems, someone else generally knows what has taken place. And this isn't like a call to tattletale on somebody. This is just thinking that you're not generally acting isolated enough or free enough from the system that nobody knows what is happening. But I think the stronger answer, the better answer, is how have you developed the constraints that prohibit some behaviors and allow other behaviors? How tight is that? If it's too tight, you don't get disorder, you just get order. If it's too open, you don't get really anything. People don't know what to do because there's nothing for them to work within. But if you can tune these constraints to the quantity, to the notes, to the tones, to the symphony that you're looking for, you can prohibit the things that you're explicitly ahead of time know you're not looking for. I think below that, it kind of sounds like you need to do a forensic sort of investigation and figure out who did what, because this is still, I think, theoretical. The way that I've experienced it when I've been in these organizations, when it's been equifinality, which is, I think, is a recipe for a complex system to emerge. Generally, everybody else already knew whoever had made the bad call. So it was never, the retrospective was really quick on that. I mean, it's not a retrospective on the scale of a multi-month incident, but I think generally there you continue constraints, and people are aware of what is happening and how it's happening. That legal aspect, though, people want is like, we want to be able to point to one person and say that you did this. Is it not the case that that's the person who established the goals? So if you can point at him and you say, so who animated this complex system? Who said, this is what I want you to get going in this particular direction? I think it's at least a little bit the case that if you're the one who said, this is what I want, and these people went about doing it, we can still locate responsibility within the leadership suite, if you will, of that response system.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Because obviously that's going to be the first nub that our hierarchical leaders directly point to. Is like, well, if I give away my control, then what?
Yeah,
But yeah,
I
that's very
know.
good. Cheers.
Then what? Then what? You get something better.
Mm. Yeah. As you can see, the sun's just come up here, which is bloody amazing. It's mid-winter here.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's nice. That's nice. All right, let me see what we got next
Keep
here.
going,
All
yeah.
right, you're gonna like this. I like this. I hope you do too. So again, we're talking about the management of complex response systems, and at the moment we're talking about planning. And there's two types of planning according to Morin, just two, programs and strategy. So the first one is a program a program. And a program is a sequence of predetermined actions that must function in circumstances that allow their completion. To say that programs work as long as the context around them allows them to work, and they will stop working once those conditions become unfavorable. The program, as Morin says, they stop or fail. So a program is a bureaucratic tool. A program is linearized work. It's linearized planning. It's linearized assignments, linearized tasks and objectives. It's, follow this, follow that. If not this, then that. Just go down the particular chain of events. But as we know from studying emergencies and from writing about emergencies, things are, as Morin said earlier in this lecture, things are and will change, likely to change. I think that's a very important thing, especially in our discipline, our field. Things are going to change, perhaps suddenly. And a program that is counting on being linearly completed is not favorable for a context like that, because it fails. Now, obviously, one of the great things about a program is it has a great economy because no one has to think. You can have a totally ordered environment with no disorder, and you just follow the things that are written down and you do the work. And then at some point, you're going to be done, and it will have been effective and efficient because nobody had to deviate. There was no change. It went as forecasted. In some places, assembly lines, sure, why not? In some places that are ordered and predictable, and as predictable can get, and they're ordered and they're rule based and they're highly regular, I think a program would be essential. But outside of that, in the emergency space, I think you're going to run into some issues. So that's where we get this particular planning method called strategy. Now, he's not using strategy in the way that strategy is as a common definition. He's saying that strategy is the rational guidance of an action in a situation and context that is ill-defined and perhaps dangerous. What does that sound like? That sounds like complexity. That's what I get when I read this. And he goes on to say that strategies are elaborated according to goals and principles, consider various possible scripts for the unfolding action, and then select one that appears to be dictated by the situation. So strategies like equifinality have multiple scripts in them. To really be equifinality, it would just be a goal, and then and maybe some insight, and you would define how you got to that strategic goal. But in this one, they seem to be saying that there are various scripts embedded in the strategy that you might elaborate on and use as sort of dictated by the situation. I think that's very important, because it gives you multiple options for the task or the objectives that you're trying to carry out. Anyways, this is important, and we've actually already seen this in practice. In order to use strategies, it cannot be carried out by a response system or an organization otherwise that was conceived to obey a program. So we tried this with I don't know where it's at now, but when I was writing papers on this in 2015, we were looking at the humanitarian assistance cluster approach, which was built to be a complex system. It was built after a complex system, but I think it was, I forget who it was now. It was one of the governing bodies wrote a big report on it and said that they were taking a highly bureaucratic approach to something that was a system. So I think that goes to say that if you're trying to plug in a strategic approach to a programmatic organization, you will you're likely to have a lot of trouble. You're likely to have a lot of difficulty. There needs to be a lot of steps in between programs and strategies before you just plug and play a strategy USB into a programmatic organization. Okay, so we're getting there. All right, this is a bit of a slide. I'll be the first one to tell you that.
Sorry, just going back to structure. To strategy.
Yeah.
Is there a westernized term that we can use in place of the term strategy that would be more applicable and acceptable to our existing environments? Because strategy has a meaning that's different to this meaning. Is there another term that we can use to greater socialize it that doesn't get confused with the term strategy that we apply?
So I think if we were to do this today, you and I think the best I could come up with is probably agile strategy. Agility, agile already has meaning in the software world. Yeah. You bet it does. But I think we could probably put a word before it or after it. Agility strategy, complex strategy, I like as well. Something that's a complexity-based strategy, something that follows, because it clearly in the first line here, it clearly already understands that it's being deployed in a complex situation. So I think that's probably one of the better ways to talk about it, is to say, it's agile strategy, it's complexity-informed strategy, it's complex strategy. I don't like complex strategy. People would probably turn their nose up at that one, I think, a little bit. But I think this organization knows, I think more knows that this is to be deployed or best deployed in a complex situation. So I do agree with you that it is problematic because he uses the word strategy, which already means a lot of things, where we do need some sort of modifier. So to make this our own in the field, we could use, complexity-informed strategy is a little clunky, but we could find a way to nimble that terminology down. That's what comes off. That's what sort of comes off the top of the head this morning. All right. So our next one is is kind of fancy. And then it'll get easier from there. So I want to talk about environmental relating as well as responder relating. And this comes out of the work of Umberto Maturana with his student Francisco Varela at the time. And they're saying there is structural coupling wherever there's a history of recurrent interactions leading to the structural congruence. That's important. There's congruence between two or more systems due to recurrent interactions over time. So I took this picture out of one of the books that Maturana wrote. Um, and I've put a responder here, as these are both humans, and a responder there. And the complexity is there. The complexity is not because they both exist. The complexity exists because they're interacting with each other, which I think is a very important point to take into consideration. And the complexity really only exists if they are richly interacting with each other. The people we work with, we do end up being, and to use this in the as vague terms possible, we do end up being the same shape as them. There are congruences between us. We know what they need before they need it. We know how to help them. We know what they're going to do. We know what they like. We become the same shape. We interlock with each other. Why is this important? So if you don't have coupled people who have some form of structural congruence, you lack a certain coherence in your response. You need to have some people who have at least some people have some regularity with each other so that they don't look like these like misshapen jelly beans. They look like more like these, I don't know, a potato and two potatoes coming together like that with all the complexity through their rich interactions being right there. So you do have congruence here, and you do have growing congruence here because they are interacting. The way that I want to share this with you is through Van Gogh's A Pair of Shoes. So if you've had hiking shoes or fire shoes or emergency responder shoes or anything really, especially climbing shoes, what happens is you break the shoe in, and you get those toe grooves, and you get those you get the heel stretched out, and you get all that. And then the shoe breaks you in and tells you where to have calluses and blisters and forms your toes a little bit differently. That's structural coupling. Is you imprint on somebody and somebody imprints on you, and that might not be the best word, but you end up having some sort of functional congruence between the two of you. And that's how you get a wonderful pair of shoes. So one of the problems with this is that it involves time. You see over here, time opening, time closing. So some segment of time has passed for the responders to get to know each other and become congruent. But there's also this structural coupling between the environment. Do you see that there? A little bit lower. Over here, they are a perfect fit for their environment. But the problem with this, the reason why this is a very, very popular way to use this theory, or this theory is very popular, I should say, is what if you don't have time? What if you don't have the luxury of knowing people? What if you don't have the luxury of knowing what's going on? What if you're thrown into an incident an hour before you were having a flat white down in Wellington? You need to be able to, it's time to go. You got it. So I think this theory does work with responders. But in terms of the environment, if you're trying to become congruent with your environment in a quickly accelerating and highly uncertain incident, what exactly are you going to become congruent to? Is the question that kind of comes across my mind. Is like, what are you going to gain the shape of so that you can be more effective when the shape is changing all the time? So it doesn't work because it takes too much time to produce something that is already passed by. It no longer exists. You've become optimized for conditions that are no longer present. So I think that's fair enough. But I have a solution, and it's really kind of a bit different than what we've been talking about, and it has to do with vibration. This is incredibly complex literature. This is some of the deepest stuff I've been in biologically, is the ear. So in what's called phase locking, so this is the second page on environmental relating, I want to fix the problem of time. I want to take time out of the equation, and I just want it to happen. I want there to be some form of relating that happens, and it can be completely autonomic. It can be completely out of your level of awareness. So this picture, I'll read one of the definitions, and there's a picture on the right that I want to share with you. That is AI, I should say. I didn't note that. So more generally, phase locking refers to the ability of a neuron or neurons to synchronize or follow the temporal structure of a sound. Okay, so what does that have to do with anything? So what this means is I like the word follow, and I like the word synchronize. Got a little spike there myself. And I like these two words because they're very similar, or they give me the impression of some form of congruence. So when I am showing up to an incident right away, the essential stuff that I need to know, obviously, is what's going on, and I will use my eyes, ears, the five senses, and I will be listening, and this is totally out of my control. This just happens. There are sound waves in the environment, and we isolate some. There can be foreground, and there can be background noise. And we have a neuron, the same neuron here, here, and here, that is firing at the peaks here, here, and here of a sound wave. Now, that might not seem completely interesting at the moment, but what it does mean is that you are capable of having, on a larger scale, your nervous system is in some way capable of being phase locked with the environment as soon as you show up somewhere. It doesn't have to be this like time-consuming particular area, and that's a 100 to 200 yard look at that. You can find a sound between foreground and background noises, and you fire a neuron in your auditory nerve, fires a neuron every time in the same structure of the sound wave. So you are retrieving temporal information and spatial information about that sound all at the same time. Now, what I am trying to do sufficiently is to replace the notion of structural coupling with something that is closer to phase locking, which is still biological. It's biological theory, with something that is happening readily and quickly all the time. I think that's important. Now, to add to the running narrative, you have two receptors, Messner's, and the closest I've gotten to this one is Phoenician. Phoenician are deeper. They're in the human body. They're closer to joints, and they can phase lock to vibrations as well. Like, I think the example that I've settled on is like being at a really loud, bassy concert, and that those vibrations move through your body, and they link up to these receptors in the in the human body, and the other ones are located on your in places like your eyelids and your fingertips. So there is a huge field throughout the human body for phase locking that I think we should be paying attention to more and more, in addition and alongside complex systems, because it's a different way of understanding how we relate to situations very quickly. And I've got two left. So I enjoy putting together a lecture. I think it's fun. I like doing the reading. I always end up learning just a ton. It's a lot of fun. Um, but it involves a lot of wandering. Um, you like a dissertation or a thesis or anything else, like there's a lot of wandering. Like what's this narrative? Who's this author? What's this over here? And we are stumbling along in night and fog, Morin says. But he says we do not wander at random, even though there is a randomness in our stride. And this is very interesting because if you're engaging with a complex system and there are no linear ways through, you're probably doing some wandering, especially if someone has given you a goal, equifinality, and no idea how to achieve that goal. You're not doing this. If there's a well-marked path through the complex system, you probably don't have a complex system. You have an ordered system. So if there's a well-treaded path, I don't think that's complexity. I think that's order, because there are no well-treaded paths that I'm aware of through complex systems. I just don't think that exists. So we take this randomness, and what we have are beacons, ideas chosen, values, and strategy. Again, there's that word strategy. We know what that means. Complexity informed strategy that gets better as it goes along. So we're using these beacons and not the law of progress to find where we should be going. We have a declination to help us through the wandering of meandering this complex system and figuring out how we're actually going to go from programmatic organizations to complexity informed complex response systems. Like, how do we get there? There's wandering that's involved with that. Last one. This is something that I'd like to talk about more, but need to write about it first, to really have that like great purchase on it and understanding. This again comes from Maturana, to deviate a little bit from the Edgar Morin. This is talking about measurement, and I think they're talking about measurement. The way that I interpret this is that they are talking about it exclusively in terms of complexity and accepting people who are maybe new to you, or maybe people you've worked with for years. I think there's a lot to be said, but the way that they talk about it aligns so strongly with, is measurement the right thing to do in complex systems? And I'm thinking that it's not. I think you can evaluate the degree to which somebody establishes a goal, like we were saying earlier with accountability. I think that was the word that was used. I think you can say, hey, that this goal had nothing to do with anything else. Like it's completely incoherent. Why did you do that? Versus something like saying, hey, we told you what we wanted done, and then you guys you wandered around for a little while, and then you did what? Oh, we figured out what our beacon was, and then we got to where we needed to go. How can you evaluate that? How can you take a metric and say, well, you shouldn't have done it that way, when in reality, as I said before, not one person knows about all the complexity throughout the incident. So how could you know about the complexity that those people were facing and walking through at the incident level? You don't. And furthermore, I like what they say here. I think it's a really beautiful sentiment. They're saying that the presence of purpose, aims, or expectations in a relationship denies acceptance, as these become the center of attention and care, which is really, really important. So, acceptance is the stand in word for love. Maturana has a theory for love that is not what love means. Normally, he's using it a different way, but I think it can be confusing. So in 1987, he said that you can use acceptance all the same, and that would be a fine stand-in word. Um, so he goes on to say the purposes, expectations, aims, let's say objectives, tasks, goals, generate blindness with respect to the participants in the relationship. So you become more focused on the goal and achieving the goal than you do of having attention and care to the people who are trying to get it. And I think that that can be dangerous in the ordered context, and it's certainly dangerous in the complex context where there just isn't complete understanding of what people um, are really doing. I mean, does your boss understand what you've been up to for the past 36 hours? They might be able to direct you and tell you what to do, but do they truly understand what you've been doing for 36 hours? Probably not. Um, so I think that I'll end with this last quote. By attending to what one expects the other to do, the other disappears and the relationship takes place in manipulation. Manipulating others to reach the benchmarks and metrics and goals that you have thus set forth. So I think I wanted to end on measurement because I think it's something that is so common in bureaucratic organizations, but is something that we probably are going to have to modify our expectations about in this great transition to complex systems. And I think that's something we really are going to need to work with is understanding how, okay, if we don't have measurement, how do we define who is good and who is bad? For a very rough sort of distinction there. How would we go about that? How would we do that? Would we listen to people? What would our approach be? Because surely people will need something for the yearly performance review. And complexity, definitely, if you're following finality and hypercomplexity and strategies, that absolutely definitely throws that definitely derails things for you. So that's all that I have this morning. I'm open to any and all questions and discussion.
Look, I don't have questions per se, but I want to thank you. This is bloody amazing, really good, and I've been taking some notes to contextualize my thought process as I've gone on. I've also had a quick Google of you and the stuff you've published, because there's a whole bunch of reading there I want to do to further explore what was discussed today. I'm going to be doing a LinkedIn post to shout out this because I think this is really something a lot of people need to experience. There's a lot of theory in here, but there's also some really great context in here that practitioners would gain value from. So thank you. Yeah, really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome.
If I go back to my notes, I've highlighted a couple of key things here. So there's a couple of authors there that I've not heard of before, which I'm going to go and explore back. But I like your discussion around the need for disorder. That disorder permits liberty, autonomy, innovation, and to get these things, to get that innovation at the edge of a novel, complex incident, you need that disorder. But the parameters, the constraints around the disorder, so you don't have too much disorder, which becomes that self-response and that autonomy that it leads to poor outcomes, I guess.
Yeah.
But that there, like I typed that up, highlighted it yellow, like this is something really to go and explore further. and I need to sit down with Morin's book.
Yeah,
Maybe
there's
buy it. Yeah.
I'll get you these slides, and I'll send them to you hopefully today, and you can go through them. There's a works cited in the back
Okay.
of everything that I used, and some stuff that I deleted at the last minute that's probably still in there. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff that I used or did use but may not be cited in the presentation. So yeah, that's the list right there. There's some excellent books. The 2023 Challenge of Complexity by Edgar Morin is really awesome. It's an essay book from really a long time ago. 1974, I think, is the oldest. He's 104 years old right now. He's still alive. I don't know if he's still writing, but he's still alive and a very important part of our complexity family.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate this. And how often do you run these?
This is my second one. I think my first one was in May. And I'm up for, if anyone has an idea or something that I'd like to hear, I'm all about coming up with something for that. I think my next one might be based on strategy in a more familiar sense, but from complexity in biology.
Yeah. So next time you run something like this, tag me in it so I can go and share it across my network, because I think this really is something that many people I know would benefit from. Even redoing this one.
Yeah, I could do that.
And maybe even if you look at in the future one that is a little bit more operationally focused, like the theory is amazing and fantastic for me. But how do you operationalize? How do practitioners and leaders operationalize some of these areas around order and disorder? How can they permit disorder within their comfort zone, or how do they expand their comfort zone to allow this? Because it goes against everything that these militaristic, hierarchical, autocratic leaders want from their space.
Indeed. Yeah, that's always the question. I think you have to this is a talk that was just in gestation for so long. And then when it finally became possible, it became possible by way of theory. So now that I've done this, and I'd like to do it again.
Yes.
To somebody else who to a group that is really interested and wants to and has the time. Maybe do that once or twice, and then do from the operations one, because it's definitely a task to take something out of one domain and put it into another, theory to practice. But I hear what you're saying. I can definitely already see the value, and my wheels are turning a little bit on how I might actually figure this out.
And I just want to compliment your depth of knowledge behind the talking points is amazing. It's something I aspire to. So just want to share some gratitude towards that. So you've set the bar high.